Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Black Mental Health Matters show, where we engage in conversation to deepen our learning about mental health challenges confronting the global Black community. I'm your host, Erica Dolland, and today we'll explore how to manage seasonal depression. Thank you again for joining us with this week's episode of Black Mental Health Matters. Today, we're going to discuss a fascinating topic, seasonal depression. Our first guest joining us today to help us understand this more in depth is Canadian psychotherapist, Dr. Joan Samuels-Dennis. She's a multi-award-winning speaker and authority on trauma recovery and truth, forgiveness, and reconciliation processes. Dr. Joan has specialized in promoting the mental health and well-being of individuals, families, and communities for over a decade through her groundbreaking trauma recovery strategy, the Becoming Method. Dr. Joan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
Fantastic. And you're coming to us from Canada.
I am. I'm right now in Kamloops, BC. We'll be migrating across the country, so soon we'll be back in Ontario.
Fantastic. Well, I wonder if you could just start by giving our audience an overview of what exactly is seasonal depression.
Yeah. So I'll start with what is depression. And depression is, in some cases, you can say it's a mild mental disorder. In some cases, you can say it's a severe mental imbalance. Let's use that word imbalance for now. But the symptoms tend to be where a person loses interest in carrying on in their daily functionings. There's also moods that are low. In addition to that, you can then have like experiences with suicidal thoughts or a lack of desire to really live. So with seasonal depression, it's linked to timelines that are linked with the environment and the ways that the seasons transition. So we say seasonal depression because it comes and it goes, and it appears to be linked with the environmental shifts.
Interesting. So could you speak a little bit more about how these environmental shifts impact the body?
Yeah. So when you become depressed, the primary thing that's happening on a physiological level is that the nervous system becomes imbalanced. So what you have is the way that we think about it now. There's a theoretical framework, and it's called polyvagal theory, developed by a gentleman named Stephen Porges. And so Stephen has isolated that there's a map that our nervous system moves through. When our nervous system is balanced and functioning well, we're at the highest brain level. That's called the ventral nervous system. So there we feel connected, there we feel balanced, there we feel like we can communicate well, interact well with people as well as the environment. If something happens, whether it's on a timeline or a seasonal shift, and that changes, we tend to go into what's called the sympathetic nervous system. So that's about the middle part or the middle brain, or what we call the second evolution of the brain. And there is where we experience the fight flight mechanism. So we feel like we must go somewhere, or we must, get out of this thing that we're afraid of. But there's also a space that we go to that's below that, and that's called the dorsal nervous system. And when you're there, literally, you begin to shut down. And so you just kind of enter like a survival mode. So even if it's seasonal or it's environmental, the body begins to shift into that survival mode. So depression, anxiety to some extent, then develops.
So what's interesting about that is that it's your well-being is really at the whim of the environment in which you're around, which is kind of scary when you think about it. Like, you want to be happy and cheerful, but I'm in a cold, I guess, can you explain a little bit the environmental factors, the different environments? So I'm assuming there's cold environments that are going to produce some sort of an emotional, physical response versus warmer environments. Is that correct?
So it depends, because I think even people in warm environments will have seasonal shifts.
Okay.
So even in warm environments, you still kind of have those seasonal shifts. So it might not be, it's more like a winter, summer. So even in those environments, you have seasons where different plants are growing, seasons where the air is different, seasons where even the ocean is moving differently. Even, the stars are moving differently in certain seasons. So what you're going to have is the environment is moving, and your body is just in a dynamic way going to move with that. So when we have sun, especially in Canada, we have the winter months, obviously, then the fall months, the spring months. And so during the winter months in particular, there is this natural dimming of the light. And so that can have an effect on people. So it's going to affect your biochemistry. And especially for Black people, we're wanting to think about vitamin D and how regulated that is in our system. And then some of us are photosensitive. So if the light is depleted, so there's less sunlight in a day, or our winters because of snow or the clouds or whatever the case may be, it's just less sunlight. So, and you're also inside more. So less fresh air, less light, shorter days, that hibernation stage kind of takes over. But in addition to that, the nervous system might just be so affected by that, it goes out of balance and kind of goes into that depleted mode.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I grew up in Minneapolis, and I have just come back from Abu Dhabi, where I was there for 10 years, where I was constantly surrounded by sunlight and warm weather and the beach, to my first Minnesota winter I haven't experienced since I was like 18 years old. And to experience this, I could just feel a change in my body and my mood from being around, just snow and cold, and that it gets darker quicker in the day, earlier in the day. I mean, it really does make an impact, and you do see a difference.
Yeah, you do. So, I'm a trauma therapist, and so we tend to think about traumatic events as events that are, dramatic, or they're charged in some way, shape, or form. But what I like to say is that an event is deemed as traumatic by our response to it. And we cannot forget that shifts, even in the climate, can cause a response that then moves us from that top level of the brain down to that middle, and then eventually it's like shifting gears down, that dorsal. So, you have to think about what is the response to the environment, because that event in and of itself causes that shift, and that would qualify it as somewhat traumatic to your system. So then you must go into a mode of really just treating the system that we're a part of, and treating your system so that it comes to that place of balance again.
So what I'm hearing you say is that there's a distinction sometimes that we need to make between experiencing seasonal depression and experiencing an actual trauma.
Yeah.
So how would I know? How would I be able to make the distinction?
Yeah, so a trauma is really defined by our response, right? So that's why some people can experience the environment and not have that response of going into dorsal. And so, others will experience it and you go down. So really you're looking at a response that makes you feel overwhelmed, makes you feel somewhat stagnant and stuck, make you feel as if you're being punished somewhat, overwhelmed certainly. And that's typically what happens when you go into dorsal, is that your system is just overwhelmed. So you have usually a bodily response where you have this nervous system imbalance. You have a mind response, which I call the mirror. And so when something is beginning to happen to us that overwhelms, we then tend to mirror whatever it is that is overwhelming us. So we can tend to mirror even the environment. And then finally, there's a spiritual response. And the spiritual response is either we're taking into a zone where we forget who we are, we forget the things that are normal to us. We go into almost a sleep mode. And so those three elements are happening. And so it's the response based on those three elements to an event that I now recognize as what makes the event traumatic versus non-traumatic.
Interesting. And I'm sure you've done a lot of study and work with even your own clients on this, which I find absolutely fascinating. There was something we had talked earlier about I wanted you to share with our audience. You had shared with me you had done some study or research on Black people's migratory experiences throughout the African diaspora and how it's made us more vulnerable to seasonal depression. And I'm not sure if I'm explaining your research correctly, but could you elaborate or give us some context for that? I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, others have done, the historical research, so I won't pretend that I know all of that. What I will suggest is that, especially amongst the diaspora, those who had a forced migration, there's certainly others that are forced into migration primarily because of poverty now. But when we think about the migratory process, and if you think about leaving the continent, entering into a ship, a dark space, the movement across seas, and then eventually coming into a place that is very different from the sunlight and all of those environmental pieces that would be, just characteristic of the continent. So now you're in a shift that is an environmental shift, but the environment is also internal. So I don't think you can ever have the internal environment that is, all of the body, mind, and spiritual things that are being reorganized because the external environment is also being, reorganized. So as we have transitioned through these phases of migration, these patterns of seasonal, we might call it deficit, they begin to happen. And what tends to happen, especially when there's a traumatic shift, is that there's a record now. And so what we know is there's a whole body of research that is now called epigenetics that is recording the ways in which these dramatic or traumatic shifts happen, and the fact that they are now recorded and embedded in our blood, in our DNA, and that they now transcend generations. So it could be that a great grandparent has now experienced this shift, and so it now travels across family lines for up to 7 generations, especially when the cycle repeats itself. So what we have seen is that there was migratory shifts coming into, for example, South America, North America, even the Caribbean. But as a people, we continue to shift, always looking for opportunities to live that better life. So we've now migrated from the Caribbean, for example, into parts of Canada, from the Caribbean and from South America into North America in all the ways that we can, and then even gone into Europe. And so there's this progressive shift across generations. So it's not like you have time to kind of settle into kind of one climate. And so those shifts, never mind things like seeds in the air. So even as trees are bearing seeds, allergies begin. And so what's the allergic reaction? We tend to think it's only biophysical, but it could also be a mental reaction to just the seeds and whatever else might be in the air. Even the barks of trees might have certain bacteria that are in them. So then you begin to have these responses that it might seem like it's seasonal depression, but it's really related to some seed that's in the air or some other sprout that's in the air, whatever that case might be.
Wow, interesting. Since we're speaking a little bit about Black people and vulnerability to seasonal depression, I'm wondering if you can identify or speak to any other cultural or societal factors that would contribute to our increased vulnerability.
Yeah, I think, you have to think about the winter months in particular as a period of time where there's isolation, and a period of time where we go indoors, right? And so you saw the reaction to COVID. So that's a long season. If you can think about the COVID season was long. So there was the going in, there was the shutting in, and very much like, the winter seasons or the long periods without light or as much light as we're used to. So the shut in, as well as, the isolation that happens with that, can have a pretty monumental effect, even when you have access to things like phone or video chats or whatever the case may be. So you can see the results of, for example, something like COVID. Now we're seeing mental health problems at a level that we have never seen before. So we've moved beyond just kind of like thinking about seasons as weather, but seasons in terms of when certain things begin to happen in our lives that are quite impactful. And the other thing that I think we have to be concerned about is there are times that we experience traumatic events. And again, it's about your response. It's not about the event. So you experience that traumatic event and it occurs at a particular time, a month, a day, a year, an hour of the day. And so what you will find is that there are patterns that repeat even in the cycle of re-experiencing emotions. And so sometimes we're re-experiencing that pattern, but because we don't think about things happening in that way, we tend to think, oh, well, it's just happening with the season. Well, what if I experience a traumatic moment just as, the season winter was starting, for example? So then, my pattern is to re-experience those emotions on that particular day and in that duration of time. But we tend to then give credit to something else, like the weather, like the environment, versus the timeline that the body works by.
Interesting. So if I'm starting to notice these certain patterns that are coming up, what do you advise people to do in terms of documenting these things or recording them so that they have something that they can refer to and say, oh, this is this pattern that's showing up. It's not necessarily connected to what's going on in my environment.
Yeah. So a very simple thing. I use applied kinesiology in my practice. And so what that means is the body records the moments in our lives that we need to look at. It records the moments of imbalances with such precision that you can actually isolate the day, the year, the month, as I said, the hour of the day when an event occurred. So that means if you're experiencing seasonal depression, and say you were transitioning from one country to another at that particular time, or say there was an event that was happening in your life at that point, I can use your body. And so, what I would suggest is folks begin to look into what's called applied kinesiology, muscle testing. And then there's some very simple techniques that you can use where you then isolate, okay, so on this day, this month, this year, my body has experienced an imbalance, a diminished vibrational energetic shift. So can I consciously remember what that moment was? Mm-hmm. And if you can consciously remember whatever that thing was that happened in that moment, then you can process it in a way that releases it. So I've had people come to me and they're experiencing depression or anxiety or some other thing. And so as they process their traumas, typically what happens is then they begin to see some of those symptoms that would normally arise at certain times, they diminish. And so they'll come back and say, I've had this particular episode every year for but after I did my therapy for 2 years now, I haven't experienced that, right? Or then they go on, it's like permanently done because you've understood it, you've consciously become aware of it, and you've processed it in a way that now makes sense for you. And as it makes sense for you, then its hold shifts. So sometimes the environment is about how tolerant we are. Like emotional tolerance is connected with what's called the lung meridian, for example. And so when we're intolerant of our environment, it's connected to breath, it's connected to life. And so if we actually go back to a moment that caused us to become intolerant, we'll see why the environment, why we've been intolerant to the environment as well. It could have been that it was a very similar environment to also what was happening in our lives. And so the two are connected in that kind of way. So the most fundamental thing that I would say is begin to read. There's a gentleman, I'm forgetting David's last name at this time, but he's really a psychologist from Australia, and he's the mind behind applied kinesiology. And so he's used applied kinesiology for some time to then be able to identify those moments. And he's also a psychiatrist or psychologist. And so he helps people process those emotions. And then what you find is there might be certain medications that you can take. For example, vitamin D is a medication. We don't think about it that way, but you can take certain herbs in order to then support you with coming into a balance again.
Fantastic. Interesting. Because my next question was going to be, what if there are people who don't have access to a kinesiologist or can't afford one? What are other possible alternatives? But I'm hearing you say that there's the use of herbs. There's also vitamin D, which I believe you can buy over the counter and you don't need a prescription for.
No, you don't. You don't. So, you could assess yourself in terms of which hormones are out of balance, so that's one way to do it. Which essential vitamins, are out of balance as well. And so you begin to balance that way. You can go to a naturopath, most naturopath will actually know applied kinesiology. Your chiropractor will know applied kinesiology as well. So the muscle strength testing can be done there. You can also learn muscle strength testing yourself. So, it requires a little bit of research. And if anybody wants to know, then they can contact me and I'm more than happy to demonstrate that for them.
Fantastic. So suppose it's not trauma. Suppose it is just the environment that I'm in. I'm stuck here. I can't go anywhere else due to financial reasons or family situation or just the way life is. This is where I am. What are things that people can do to cope with seasonal depression?
Nobody has to cope with depression anymore, right? Like the science is so far. Mm-hmm. No one needs to cope with depression anymore. Mm-hmm. And so if you've been sitting with depression for years, right, there's science that is out there that helps us to overcome it, right? Mm-hmm. So Stephen Porges, who came up with polyvagal theory, he has filtered music. And filtered music, it works with the middle ear. And so with the middle ear, it's where we feel balanced. Mm-hmm. So the filtered music, you play it for 5 days. It's a treatment program. psychotherapists have to deliver that treatment. But essentially, you're listening to this filtered music. It helps you to feel safe, even if you're in an environment that makes you feel unsafe. It helps you to feel safe. Safety is what elevates us to the top brain. So once your body comes to that place where you feel safe, then you can work towards, okay, once you feel safe, you think clearly. You're able to go and ask the right questions of the right people. You're able to go and seek the help with a therapist if you need to. You're able to work with your physician, do your hormonal assessments, take the right vitamins or essential oils or whatever the case may be. And there's so many things that you can do that is not inexpensive or expensive. The only thing that people should not do is refuse to act. Don't make depression normal. Don't make it like something that you need to experience. That's the fundamental issue with us as Black people. We tolerate the stuff for far too long, and we don't have to do that anymore. The science is out there. So like I said, filtered music, light therapy. You can go to a spa these days where you take a bath and it literally will take out all the toxins from your body. So there's so much that we can do in order to get our bodies back into that state of balance. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I think I love what you said about the need to not have to cope anymore.
Yeah.
And fortunately, to shows like this and just advocacy work and people sharing their own stories with depression and mental health, it's becoming safer and more comfortable for people to ask for help, which I think is fantastic and rewarding, and to the work that you're doing in Canada to make space and provide assistance to those people who need it. So I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's time for us as a people to end the shame game, because this is literally body reacting to something. So there's no shame, there's no blame in it. You simply just recognize what the body does when the body encounters something, whether it's the environment or whether it's something else. So, you simply just act from that place. No shame, no blame, no need to judge, no need to criticize yourself. You simply just act. The only thing that makes you sicker is inaction.
Very true. Very true. Dr. Joan, we have about 4 minutes left. I wanted to give this time for you to share with our audience some of the great work that you're doing, services, products that you can offer us that would be of value.
Yeah. I am the chair of what's called the National Healing Journey. This is a coalition of community builders, thought leaders, researchers, just folks who love Black people. And so we have started, we're going on a mission really to get every single Black person in the world to recognize racism and our experiences of the past. And I love that slideshow that you put up at the beginning, your introduction. 100% of Black people have been traumatized. And I did a questionnaire the other day where I asked the question, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you agree that every single Black person in the world has been traumatized? So we haven't gotten the results to that yet, but a trauma is simply a response to an event or a non-event. And that event, as I've mentioned before, is going to cause a bodily response, a mind response, and a spiritual response. And so when you look at that, we're asking everyone to recognize racism as one of those fundamental issues that have harmed us as a people. And beyond that, we're asking everyone to go on a trauma recovery journey. And so some of these things like seasonal affect disorder, personality disorder, PTSD, all the ways in which we have coped with our traumas, all of that will be resolved. Not only that, we're asking communities across the globe to go on communal healing journeys using truth, forgiveness, and reconciliation. So that's kind of the primary piece that I wanted to get out there. In addition to that, I'm a psychotherapist. And as you mentioned, I use the Becoming method. That's a method that I developed. It incorporates applied kinesiology, forgiveness, and a couple of other therapeutic methods that are quite effective. So even folks who've been ill for years upon years, they come and they see me, and within 3 sessions, they're good. I have a 16-week program that helps to maintain them after they get those results. So, if you want to reach out to me, I'm more than happy to assist you in just going on your recovery journey.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joan, for joining us.
You're most welcome.
Have a good day. And we are just waiting for Dr. K. Hubbard for joining us.
Hello.
If you've just joined us, we're discussing seasonal depression, and our second guest is Dr. K. Hubbard. She focuses on the intersection of health, self-empowerment, and creativity. Using the gifts of naturopathic therapies to create the basis for health, she encourages her clients to cultivate the desire and skill to heal themselves. Dr. K utilizes homeopathy, botanical formulations, nutritional guidance, and holistic counseling to address each client as an individual. She's also trained as an array of mental wellness therapeutic modalities, including narrative, mindfulness-based creative arts, African-centered and acceptance and commitment therapy. Dr. K obtained her doctorate in naturopathic medicine from the National University of Health Sciences and graduated from Antioch University with an MA in clinical psychology. And she also holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Duke University. Dr. K, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you. And thank you for reading my bio.
Yes, you're welcome. So I'm just curious, with your background, we've been talking about seasonal affective disorder or depression, and I wanted to just know what do you bring to the conversation in terms of your very diverse background in holistic therapies?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Joan covered so much. But my approach, while I agree with everything she said, my approach is a bit more intuitive. Naturopathic doctors are trained to support an individual and find a root cause, which means that even though people may have similar symptoms, or a diagnosable criteria is met, we will still look at the individual method of how it presents in this specific person and what may be the specific cause, and approach it in that way. So I guess that would be the main difference. Like it's great to know all of the things about how to treat a broader scope or what patterns may be presenting. But for me, seasonal affective disorder or depression can show up very differently for every person as well.
So can you break down, can you give us an example of what is your approach using a client maybe who is coming to you? I'm from Minneapolis, it's been in the cold. I'm feeling down, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling moody, I don't want to go out. What if I were to come to you, what would be the approach that you would take?
Right. So I'm going to greet you and welcome you in. Most of my consults are virtual, so I'm sure we'll chat about the weather and you'll be jealous of the fact that I'm in Guadalajara and it's always sunny. But then I will ask if this happens every year. I will ask, I'll ask what you eat. I will ask if you're taking any supplements already. I will ask if anyone else in your family experiences this. And I'll ask about other times in your life to know if there is a difference if you're somewhere sunnier during this time of year. It's pretty, yeah. That's how it would start. But then what happens? Then I would do, depending on the answers. So for example, if you say, this is my third winter back, or, third spring and it's still gloomy and it pulls me down every year this time of year. I will also ask if there's been events during that time, like, oh, have you ever lost anyone in the season or had a bad breakup or had any other transitions that may still be holding on as memories? Because I work a lot with grief. And I think that grief kind of floats in seasons.
Interesting. It's very similar to what Dr. Joan was speaking about how we hold those traumatic experiences in our body. that may have surfaced or we may have experienced during a very similar time of the year in which that trauma is being triggered in the moment. So that's very interesting. I don't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, you're great. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Because I know people have different anniversaries and different times when it's like, yeah, I feel sad, but I don't know why. It's been going on for 6 years. What happened 6 years ago? Oh, I lost this job and it was devastating. Well, let's talk about that. So I do a lot of therapy in that way. But I may also pull in homeopathic remedies because homeopathic remedies can be specific enough to be worse when it's raining, but better when it's windy. And it can relate.
Can you explain to our audience what homeopathic remedies are for people who don't know what that is?
Yes, absolutely. I get ahead of myself sometimes. 'Cause I get excited about it. So a lot of people think of when they hear like, oh, a holistic doctor, they do homeopathy or they do, the words are synonymous. But actually, homeopathy is a system of medicine that's separate, that was founded by, well, that's slightly debatable, but I'll go with the textbook answer, which is that Samuel Hahnemann was a German man who wrote it all down because he came up with this idea of homeo, meaning similar, pathy, meaning suffering or pathos. So you would treat a symptom with something very similar to it, as opposed to what many of us are used to, which is allopathy, which is against suffering. So the traditional, or I'll say the Western models of medicine are, oh, you have a symptom, you have a headache, I'm going to give you something that stops the pain, that interrupts the biological pathway of that. Homeopathy says, I'm going to give you a very, 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 very minute dose of a botanical or or maybe like a piece, like a little tiny, like an animal. Sometimes they'll have like a venom or something that would, like a bee venom would be one. That would cause this symptom in you if we gave it in its normal quantity, like in its full quantity. But instead, I'm going to give you like a little tiny bit that's been diluted to a point where it's just energetic. And then that will stimulate your body to heal. That's how homeopathy works.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing you say is, I'm experiencing what I think is seasonal depression. You hear the concern, and what you do is you try to dissect and see if there's something deeper underneath what you think is just this presenting, which is just a presenting symptom of something deeper that is going on, if that's what I'm understanding you correctly.
Yes. Yes, because I want to know how and why this specifically shows up in you at this time. Homeopathy is one way in. Another way is botanicals or supplements and herbs, which Dr. Joan was mentioning. Some other ones maybe, like vitamin D is important. Like it does so many things. And it's what we get from the sun. So when we're thinking about seasonal depression, a lot of people jump to that one because people with more melanin in their skin have a little bit of a trickier time getting vitamin D from the sun, so we need a little bit more.
And when you don't have vitamin D, what happens? How does that affect the body?
Oh, so
you just went like, just having some technical difficulties here. Can you hear me? Okay, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Where was
vitamin D? You're talking about vitamin D.
Yeah. So vitamin D, it's also a hormone. Like it's a vitamin, but it's also a hormone that creates other hormones that regulate mood. So that's why it's so helpful in this particular reasoning. There's other supplements such as, like if we're thinking about herbs, adaptogenic herbs. People who have been to anxiety talks hear about this one a lot. because it's adaptogen, meaning that it can pull you, if you're feeling low, it can pull you up. If you're feeling up and too jittery and dysregulated that way, it can kind of modulate you back down.
Mm-hmm.
So it's another good one for this time of year, or if you're feeling these symptoms. And then if you're not vegan, then fish oils are super supportive to the nervous system as like a neurotonic, because they help the actual nervous tissue develop.
Interesting. So I'm hearing you say vitamin D, I'm hearing you say fish oil, and I'm hearing you say
Adaptogenic herbs.
adaptive ginger. Okay. Do you have any other ideas to with your work in the holistic space, aside from taking any supplements? Like what are some things that people can do on their own to help with possible seasonal depression?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that. One of my, it depends on how the case presents, of course, but I believe that mixing things up is good when you have seasons that recur.
Mm-hmm.
Grief is important. It's something that we all go through, or seasons of processing. I'm thinking about all the places that I've lived. I've spent time in LA. The seasons there are very mild. You could maybe say that about Mexico, but it's mostly just hot. So you're kind of like always on summer compared to other places. But I've also lived in Chicago and in Virginia, which have much stronger and predictable seasons, or unpredictable, depending. Anyway, what I would say is create new memories in the season. So yeah, like, because another thing that isn't always talked about with seasonal affective disorder is the holidays are there. The family holidays, the Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Valentine's Day. I could keep going, but there's these holidays that remind you that you're supposed to be with family or with loved ones. And so it's usually the highest uptick for their, mental health professionals. And we end up talking a lot about, what's going on? Like, what family triggers do you have? It pulls people back into that energy. But creating memories with chosen family, or finding something about mistletoe that's joyful, even if you didn't like it before, can be really intentional ways to shift that.
So the shift in the memory is going to impact then the shift in the physical body and the response. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Creating new memories for myself. So what can I do intentionally to create a shift in how I think about something or I'm experiencing this, whether it's real or not? Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. Because everything that's a trigger doesn't have to be like a really heavy trigger.
Yeah.
It could be, the first snow is so pretty, but now I'm remembering when my puppy used to play in it, but that's a childhood memory I can't have anymore. So like that sort of thing. And then it's like, let me keep living forward. And I associate now with the first snowfall. Another piece that is interesting though, because this was new news to me. I remember seeing this like a month or two ago on a friend's Facebook. I get information from lots of places. And it's a fellow doctor. And she said, my seasonal affective disorder comes in summer months, the heat.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think people tend to associate with the winter and cold weather. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think even in the DSM-5, it's kind of like directs you towards that, like depressive feelings, etc.
Yeah.
And so she explained it, and she said, the heat and the prolonged sunlight keeps me up later. And then I get more irritable because I've had less sleep. And she happens to be very heat intolerant, which makes her kind of grouchy because heat is just difficult. So it would be better for her to live somewhere like Seattle, where the summers are kind of short and there's, some cloud cover, which,
Yeah.
and then it got me thinking about, she also happens to be melanated, but it got me thinking about other people in the diaspora where the holiday season is flipped, where it's summertime when it's Christmas,
Mm-hmm.
And that would kind of change the associations around different holidays, I think.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned to you earlier, I used to live in Abu Dhabi. So, July and June were some of our hottest months. And the heat can be suffocating and overwhelming, more than people, I think, realize. It's not always joyous, but it can get suffocating. It's hot. And that heat can really bring down, it can make you extremely tired. It can start to make you grouchy. It even suppresses your appetite, so you're eating less, and then you're feeling more weak. So, yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is seasonal depression doesn't necessarily surface in cold climates and areas, but also where there could be excessive heat, that could trigger certain behaviors and responses. A couple questions more. I just wanted to know what. I think you kind of spoke to this already, but saying that you are the work that you do in the field is the antithesis of the medical establishment, the tried and true. I'm curious, what do you think? What changes do you think need to be made in that healthcare system when we're talking about issues like seasonal depression and Black people? Some of the misconceptions.
Ooh, okay. Antithesis is such a strong word, which is, I was like, oh. So first, I'll clarify that, and then I'll answer your question. So naturopathic doctors, because there's different levels of naturopathy, and yes, we try to focus on indigenous medicine, but it got westernized when it turned into a school with a licensure, which is the degree that I had. So I actually can prescribe pharmaceuticals. Like, I'm not very anti-medical.
Okay.
But the model would be use the lowest intervention force necessary. Like, I can't do surgery, but I wouldn't jump to recommending surgery or pharmaceuticals if I know that changing what you eat will help. We'll start there. Okay. But of course there are situations where people do need higher level interventions, and I'm not against it. Okay. But the medical model, yes, it's messed up. What needs to change? So many things. I mean, I think about the public health implications of access to care, and it being just being systemic issues of who can come, where is the hospital, how hard is it to get there, why are the wait times so long, all of those sort of issues that can be logistical. But honestly, I would say the work that I feel like I can do in my private life and in my professional life is in coaching people to be advocates for themselves, coaching people to be attuned with what their body may need, which changes the conversation that you have with a medical doctor if that's all that you have access to. Because when you go in and you say, something's not right, I have symptoms, and they go, your labs look normal. This happens all the time. Your labs look normal. I ran the spot checks. I'm not running any other labs. We don't need to check. But you know that it's off. Actually knowing to not listen to your doctor and keep digging. That's what I think needs to happen for people who look like us. And women also in general. But yeah.
Well, listen, we have a few minutes left. I want to give this time for you to share any of your services, offerings that you think would be of value to our audience and how they can connect with you.
Yeah. So I always have a lot going on. We'll see what I say today. I am a mental wellness practitioner with Soul Care Collective, which you can find at soulcarecollective.org. There's a lot of different services on there, everything from what is akin to therapy. I'm not calling it therapy because we work across the diaspora virtually. So there's that. There's also like you can tap into African spirituality and those sorts of things on that platform. So on top of that, those wellness sessions where I do nutritional support, I read people's labs, I teach them how to be advocates for themselves. I do homeopathy, which we spoke about, and then I also do therapy. So on top of that, I also run a course called Thriving Authentically, Embracing Self-Healing. And it's an experiential workshop that's also done virtually, which is not something that I had seen before because I usually go to them in person. But the idea is to create breakthrough experiences for Black and Brown people in a way that is tangible for them. So my best example of that is I've been to a workshop where they have you, it's usually condensed, it's like a 4-day intensive weekend, and you have to like go for it. Like you're trying to get this emotional breakthrough to unblock something. And I remember being in the room, it was me, me, and the other person of color was like an Indian man. And the exercise was to yell at your mom or dad, like call up the energy or image of them and like deal with the unresolved issues, which intellectually I get. But when you think about the cultural context of that, it's like, we don't do that. Respect your elders is always in front of whatever exercise, right? So my course, Thriving Authentically, is a much more attuned approach to those sorts of conversations. And I have a cohort running right now, but I'll start it again in the fall. And I'm an author, so I wrote a book that you can find on Amazon called Unconquerable Soul.
That sounds amazing. Well, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. And for the rest of you who are watching us or listening to us, thank you again for joining us. You can learn more about Black Mental Health Matters at bmhm.org. And we look forward to you joining us next week. Thank you and take care.